Hello and welcome to our first recorded lecture. Uh, by this time we've met up on Zoom, introduced ourselves. So the majority of the lectures in this course you'll be watching in this format, and we will be getting together to discuss these in a relatively short Wednesday session for about an hour, right? So I'm not doing lectures on the short philosophical fiction I gave you. Those are just for you to have fun reading, um, sort of help introduce you to some of these concepts in a format that's a little more pleasant to read. Um, you may have noticed if you've already read the Descartes that now we're jumping back into, the 1600s, and this was originally written in Latin and has been translated in a way that, does its best to be sort of um, easy to read, but it's markedly different, right? A little bit tougher. So wanted to ease you in with a little philosophical short fiction. We'll discuss it a bit on Wednesday um, if you have any thoughts about it. But the lectures properly start with this with Descartes here, and this is our buddy Rene Descartes. Let me introduce you to him briefly. So back to the early 1600s, right? So this is the beginning of what we typically call the Enlightenment. What we mean by the Enlightenment, it's sort of the early stages of science and just in general um, uh, of intellectual activity, right, that is separate from religion. Prior to this, anything that you would consider sort of similar to a university or a place where learning happened or academics happened um, was within the context of the church, within monasteries and things like that. Now, lots of very interesting, right, clever, brilliant things were written, right? Lots of philosophy was done, um, but it was largely within the bounds of the Christian tradition, at least in Europe, right? And there was lots of other very interesting philosophizing going on um, in right, the Islamic tradition, and then also in China and the Asian traditions of philosophy. So, but by and large, there was not like a distinct intellectual tradition from the dominant religious tradition in each of those areas. This starts to change in the beginning of the Enlightenment, right? So Descartes is one of these sort of seminal Enlightenment figures. His sort of biography is kind of interesting. Um, he sort of inherited a little money at a relatively young age, then sort of went out to see the world, worked as a mercenary soldier, sort of a soldier for hire, um, made some money as a gambler for a while, and finally sort of made enough money that he was able to retire relatively young and devote his entire life to philosophy. And you find, right, when you read sort of many of these philosophers from this period, you kind of had to be independently wealthy or a monk, basically, to be able to do philosophy for a living at the time. Interesting fellow. He really sort of liked to sleep late, stay in bed most of the morning, and do all his thinking and philosophizing in bed. Um, his death he finally died when he took work as a tutor in a snowy climate, and he had to get up early and walk through the snow to work, and he couldn't handle it. Right, he caught a cold or caught some sort of disease and died. But not before he made some important contributions to mathematics. So if you he invented calculus, or him and Newton sort of independently at the same time, more or less, both invented calculus. The Cartesian plane, which I'm sure you've experienced in geometry, that is Descartes as well. And then also is often the first figure you will encounter in a philosophy course. So what we're interested in, right? So this is the unit on epistemology, right, which is theory of knowledge. Um, and the passages that I had you read are concerned with this issue. How do we know what we think we know, right? So you certainly um, walk around knowing a lot of things, or at least thinking you know a lot of things, right? Um, and Descartes is concerned with making that systematic, right? Um, so he points out that he has thought he knew a lot of things, and it turns out that he was wrong about many of those things, right? I've experienced that myself. Just one example, right? It was not until I was like in graduate school in my 30s that I found out that the plural of octopus is not octopi, right? It is in fact octopuses. Um, I couldn't believe it at first. I was shocked, and then I looked into it, and sure enough, right, I've been running around for decades, right, thinking I knew something, and in fact, I was mistaken, right? Multiply that times 1,000 things, right, over my life. Um, we often find we're mistaken about things that we were certain that we knew, right? If you want to take a moment and try to think of any examples from your life, um, maybe we can discuss those on Wednesday, right? But almost certain that all of you have some example like this, right? And since you happen to be wrong about those things that you thought you knew, um, well, that sort of casts doubt on all the things you currently think you know, right? It could turn out that in a day or a week or a few years, it will turn out that you were wrong about many of those things as well, right? I mean, there's nothing special about the way you acquired the things you think you know now. Um, the way you learn them is pretty haphazard, really, right? You learn some in university through teachers, you pick up stuff from TV, from friends, um, and except for really, I mean, some of these university courses are the exception, where you are sort of given the information systematically and you're told why and how you know the things. But so much of what we know, we just sort of pick up and assume, right, that we know it. Um, so Descartes would like to do a little better than this. He'd like to be more systematic about sort of all of our knowledge. Well, how would we go about doing that? How could we be more systematic and try to be more certain, right, about the things we think we know? Um, one way to approach it would be to examine every single belief that you have, right, every single bit of supposed knowledge, and check up on it, right, and see if you do know it or not. Um, that would literally take forever, right? Even though there's probably a sort of a finite number of space in your brain, right, for the various beliefs you have. Even so, even with a finite number of beliefs, that entails actually an infinite amount of knowledge, right? So not only is there like all this knowledge you have or supposed knowledge you have that you don't even really think about until you encounter it, right? One piece of knowledge you have is that the best way to drink from a cup is to use the handle, right? Um, until you sort of bring it up, you're like, oh yeah, I guess I do know that. You never probably wouldn't have thought of it. And you also know that if there isn't a handle, then here's the next best way, right? Or if it's kind of heavy, then maybe you this way, right? But you seem to have a vast amount of knowledge just about how to drink from a cup, right? Um, also, just given the rules of logic, right? If I know, say, that grass is green, I also know that grass is green or the sky is white, right? So this is sort of just a um, how logic works. If I know one thing, then I can add any other statement or an or statement to it, and I know that too, right? Now, obviously, the sky isn't white, right? The sky is blue, but because the grass is green is true, right? Only one of those statements needs to be true for the or statement to be true. So I can literally add anything on the other side of the or, right? An infinite number of statements to the other side of the or. I mean, I know that I own less than 1,000 pairs of sunglasses. I know that I own less than 1,001 pairs of sunglasses, and so on, right? If the numbers are infinite, then my knowledge about the numbers of pairs of sunglasses I have is also infinite. So it seems like it's going to be impossible, even in principle, right, to investigate the infinite number of propositions that technically I know, right? Um, so he's not going to pursue that approach. Instead, Descartes says, look, I'm just going to doubt everything. I'm going to assume I actually know nothing, right? Um, and I'm going to try to start from scratch, see what sort of knowledge I can build back up, right? Is there one piece of knowledge that I can start with and then, right, start building back up? So this sort of approach to epistemology, again, epistemology, theory of knowledge, um, is called foundationalism, right? Which is the claim that, okay, we need to start with something that can't be doubted, something that's guaranteed true, right? Some guaranteed piece of knowledge, and then we build up from that foundation. So a reasonable place you might think to start with as the basis of our knowledge is the senses, right? It seems like much of what we think we know is derived from the senses. We either saw it or heard it or smelled it, right? So, for example, he knows he's sitting in a chair wearing a red shirt and that there's a lamp on the table, right? How does he know that? Because he sees it. It's right there. Um, that seems about as sure as any knowledge we have. And in fact, if you're sort of someone tells you something and you doubt them, one way you can sort of verify it is to go see for yourself, right? Seeing is believing, and so on. So is that the foundation, right? Sensation, right? If we sense it, then we know it. Well, think about that for a minute, right? Have you ever, if you've seen The Matrix or you've seen Inception or something like that, um, you may have an idea about how even, right, your apparent sensory information could be mistaken, right? Um, Descartes might be hallucinating, right? Someone may have slipped LSD in his little mug of tea, right? Or he could be dreaming, right? I think we've all experienced dreams that are completely convincing, right? It's not until you wake up that you realize, oh, I was not sensing any of those things that I thought I was sensing, right? I dreamed that I was on a train, right, in Russia or whatever, and then I wake up and, oh, wow, it seems so real, right? I've even been dreamed that I woke up, right, from the dream, and like, oh, that was a weird dream, and then I wake up for real, or as I think for real, right? That's the big question. Um, how do I know that I'm not dreaming right now? Seems like you can't. That's sort of the whole premise, right? The whole point of movies like Inception or The Matrix. The little top, if you've ever seen Inception, right? The idea is like somehow that top tells you whether you're dreaming or not, because if you're dreaming, then it never falls down or something. But even that's not really a true test, right? There's no reason the top can't fall down in a dream. So, how can Descartes really know that he's really sitting in that chair wearing that red shirt next to the lamp? How does he know he's not dreaming it? Descartes says, yeah, that's a tough one. I'm not sure. But how about this? Even if I can't know whether I'm dreaming, right, and maybe all the sensations I'm having in my dream are not actually things in the world, but I am having these sensations, and those have to come from somewhere, right? The what we call the content, right, of the dream. So, for example, if I'm dreaming, right, that I'm sitting in a chair and whatever, and I'm doing something, drinking a cup with my hands, right? Okay, well, how can I dream I have hands if I've never heard of hands, like they never existed? I can't have just invented hands, right? So even if I don't know that right now in this moment I'm actually sitting in a chair wearing a red shirt next to a lamp, right? Because I might be dreaming. In some sense, I must know that those sorts of things exist in order to be able to dream about them, right? Well, right? Descartes is not even so sure about that, actually, right? Because think about this. Um, we can construct images of things that don't actually exist, right? Painters can paint unicorns even though there's no unicorns, right? How do they do that? Well, they have the idea of a horse, right? They have the idea of a horn, and they just smush them together, right? Um, so what if maybe hands don't exist, right, in the real world? Maybe only fingers. Maybe everybody just has single fingers, right? And then in my dream, right, my brain just sort of mashed together five fingers, right, and made a thing called a hand. Um, so really all you need, if you think about it, is like some basic building blocks like colors and shapes, right? And if those existed, if you knew about those, then you could build up all the other stuff out of dreams, right? If you knew what red was, right, and you had some basic shapes, you could put together a red shirt in your dream, even if those don't exist in the real world. But even if that's the case, we still have something that we could potentially know exists, colors and shapes, right? I didn't invent colors and shapes, right? Those came from the real world, even if I'm all the other stuff I'm sort of pasting together from those basic building blocks. But Descartes not even so sure about that, actually, if you think about it, right? So he's doubting real hard right now, right? Consider the shapes, right? Shapes actually reduce to geometry. And again, Descartes knows a lot about geometry, right? He invented Cartesian geometry. Geometry and mathematics, right? So you might think that even if I'm dreaming, right, I can't be mistaken that 2 plus 3 equals 5, or that all the points on a circle are equidistant from the other, right? That's just sort of the definition of a circle. That's that follows from sort of the axioms of mathematics that 2 plus 3 equals 5. Those aren't contingent on any sensory information, right? Um, that's just pure reason, mathematics and geometry. So since they don't derive from the senses, I can't be mistaken about those, right? It's like pure logic, right? Um, but Descartes says, I don't know. Strictly speaking, right? Uh, what about this, right? Suppose that there's some evil demon out there, and this demon, for whatever reason, has decided to make it his life's work to mess me up and deceive me. So every time I try to think about math, and I think, 2 plus 3 equals, he tricks me up, right? What if 2 plus 3 actually equals 4, and the demon gets in there and tricks me, and I make a mistake, and I think it's 5, or something like that, right? Um, Certainly, like we've all made mistakes, right? Doing geometry proofs or doing math homework, right? Um, so what if there is some force, right? It's certainly possible that there's somebody out there making sure that I make a mistake every single time. So even what I think I know, right? Even if I think it's just derived purely from math and geometry, I could still be all of that as well, right? And here we end in meditation one. And we're in a situation which we call radical skepticism, right? Descartes has not managed to find anything he can't doubt. Um, so far as we are, we don't know that we know anything. Um, and if this is sort of where you stop, right? If you agree with all this, you'd be a radical skeptic, right? And you think you can't know anything. So moving on to meditation two, here's where Descartes finally finds some foundational knowledge and starts to build. So in meditation two, he finds something he can't doubt. That's his foundation. Uh, so what is that thing? Well, let's pick up where we were at the end of meditation one, right? And assume that we're being tricked by an evil demon, right? And even the stuff I think I know about math and geometry, which is totally not even derived from the senses, it's just pure reason. Even that I'm mistaken about. He's tricking me every time. Well, hey, if I'm being tricked or if I'm doubting, there's one thing that's guaranteed, which is that I exist, right? Um, I can't be tricked if I don't exist. I can't doubt if I don't exist, right? So even in the evil demon scenario, I must exist. And this is his sort of quote, I exist is necessarily true each time that I pronounce it or that I mentally conceive it, right? So when I say I exist, that's going to be true, necessarily true, which means can't be false. No possible world where it's false. Why say that? Why is it necessarily true? Because to deny it would be a contradiction, right? So if I say I don't exist, how could that possibly be true, right? Who's saying they don't exist, right? Some existing thing. So just being able to express the proposition that I exist guarantees my existence, right? And that's the famous cogito ergo sum that doesn't actually really show up anywhere in the meditations. I think, therefore I am, right? But that is the inference that he's making. I'm thinking, right? Being deceived is a form of thinking, doubting is a form of thinking, right? And if I'm doing any of those, then I'm guaranteed to exist. All right, we have a foundation, we have a piece of knowledge that we cannot doubt. I exist, right? Um, Again, how do I know it? Why can't it be doubted? Because I can't deny it. If I say I don't exist, that's just absurd, right? Who just uttered that statement then, right? Who had that thought? Okay, so I exist. I know it for sure. Can't doubt it. Do I know anything else about myself, right? Can I get my hands back yet? My red shirt? Well, um, Descartes starts to sort of reach around for what else. What else can we build off of this? What else did I think I knew? I thought I knew I was a man, right? And what is a man? It says, well, according to Aristotle, a man is a reasonable animal, right? And of course, this applies to women too. Back then, man was sort of the default pronoun for all of humanity, right? Okay, well, does that help, right? Am I a man? Do I know that? Do I know I'm a reasonable animal? Well, to know I'm a reasonable animal means I have to define reasonable and I have to define animal, and then those are going to be defined in terms of other concepts, right? That I then have to define. So that seems like an endless goose chase, right? To chase down what it is to know I'm a man. It seems like the same sort of problem as trying to check out my old beliefs one by one. Again, I've just given myself an infinite task, right? So it's impossible to complete it. Okay, so is there another approach to building on our foundational knowledge here? What else did I think I know about myself? I thought I had a body, right? But it turns out that knowledge came from my senses, and we can't trust our senses yet. Um, the demon could easily be tricking me about that, right? He can't trick me about whether I exist, but he might be tricking me about whether, I have a body or whether I'm sort of some kind of embodied intelligence, right? Um, so all we know is that we're thinking, right? But we're guaranteed that we're thinking. So let's call that thinking part of me a soul, right? Different from the body, right? I don't know if I have a body, but I know I got the thinking part. And if we call the thinking part a soul, I know I got a soul, right? And again, the word soul has all kinds of other religious implications in our sort of current world, but here Descartes is just defining it as the part that thinks, right? So I know I think, and so I know I have the part that thinks. So I know I've got that. So at the very least, I know I am a thing that doubts, is a quote, understands, conceives, affirms, denies, wills, refuses, imagines, feels. So this is sort of him defining thinking. It's not so much a strictly like, necessary and sufficient conditions sort of definition. It's just sort of a list of things that count as thinking, right? Um, but this is the foundation and beginning to build up a little bit, right? I know I exist, right? And I know I am the kind of thing that thinks, right? At the very least, I'm that. Um, and what is it to think? It's all these things: understanding, conceiving, affirming, and so on, right? Um, so we've got a foundation. He did it. It's pretty convincing, right? I'm convinced by it, but at the end, last slide, we'll cast a little doubt maybe on his inferences, but um, here's real philosophical progress, right? It happened a long time ago, but he did it, right? It seems like impossible to doubt that I exist, and I can say a few more things about the sort of thing I am, given that I know I must be thinking, right? Um, but we end up in a rather strange world. It's sort of turned everything on its head, right? All the things that we thought we were most certain about, which was, the evidence of our senses, the existence of tables, birds, and rocks, those turn out to be actually very doubtful, right? We might easily be dreaming or deceived by an evil demon. Um, and instead, the things we were the most certain about are sort of the most abstract things, right? That we are souls, right? Um, so that's interesting, right? He's just sort of turned our whole the order of how we sort of like think we know about things on its head, right? And this is sort of a core divide in the history of philosophy between the rationalists, which is what Descartes is, and then the empiricists, which are sort of the next generation of well-known Western philosophers. Um, now, what it means to be a rationalist is to say that, look, reason is the foundation of everything we know. That's the most certain thing, right? Um, and the senses are not the foundation. Now, Hume and Locke, these two folks here, later they're going to take sensation, the senses, to be the foundation of our knowledge, right? So they're exactly opposed to each other here. Um, so Descartes takes a moment to convince us that his approach is the right one, right? And he uses the example of a piece of wax. So he says, I'm sitting here by the fire, right? Again, he likes to be cozy. If he gets out of bed at all, he's going to be sitting by a nice roaring fire, right? He's playing with a piece of wax, right? Thinking, philosophizing. He says, look at this wax. You can see its shape, its color, right? It's got all these, again, sensory properties. I can smell it, feel the texture, I can taste it, it's sweet. Um, so it's got all these properties, and that's how, right, typically people and these empiricists think we know about the things by its sensory properties. But he says, look at this. I take this wax, I put it a little closer to the fire. Now all of those properties change, right? It starts to melt and the shape changes, the color gets darker, the texture is, right, more soupy, becomes more liquidy, even the smell and the flavors change, right? So if it's still the same piece of wax, which it must be, none of those sensory properties were actually essential to the wax, right? They've all changed. So what's left of the wax, right? What is it that is the essence of the wax if it's not its shape, color, smell, and all these sensory properties? Well, he says all that's actually left of the wax is my idea of it, right? Nothing about it has changed the same, has stayed the same, except for my idea of it as the same wax. So what is really my foundation of knowledge about the world, right, is my ideas about things, is the intellect, because sensory properties are fleeting. Um, and he thinks that's true not only of wax, but of every physical body in the world, right? Here's his quote: even bodies are not properly speaking known by the senses. Instead, we know them through. Okay, so where are we then? At the end of meditation two, and we're going to read some more Descartes, right? So by the end of meditation two, we know a few things, right? We know I exist. We know what this I thing, we know a little bit about it. We know it's a thinking thing. And we know by thinking we mean the sort of list of doubting, judging, etc., right? So we don't really have a proper definition of thinking per se, a list of examples, right? But sometimes that is the best definition of something, right? Poo-poo that sort of definition. Um, it's not a ton, right? Um, but it is a totally unshakable foundation for knowledge, right? According to Descartes. So this is an impressive bit of philosophizing. That's why it continues to get taught, I think, in every philosophy course. Um, but there are a few objections, right? There is an inference that Descartes makes that's not entirely clear, right? So remember, Descartes says, okay, I'm doubting, right, or being deceived. If I'm doubting or being deceived, then I exist, right? So he goes from the existence of a doubt to I exist, right? And you might wonder where do we get that inference? Where does the I come from, right? You might think that at most he has proved that a thought exists, right? Um, how do we know that if a thought exists, there's some sort of thinker that comes along for the ride? Um, I mean, it's an interesting question, and a lot has been written on it on either side. Some people think, no, you don't get a thinker along with it. There's just a thought. It's just sort of he's playing tricks with our sort of understanding of grammar, right? Since our language, we tend to have to add a grammatical subject to a sentence, right? That he sneaks in something metaphysical along with the grammar. Um, or you might think there's some deeper reason to think that anytime there's a thought, it's in the nature of thought to to be um, to imply sort of the thinker or an agent, right? That it's hard to conceive of what a thought would be like if it didn't also have some kind of person or being attached to it that was sort of experiencing the thought, right? Um, so maybe he's not just tricking us with grammar, right? Maybe there is some deeper reason, but he doesn't really give us any reasons for that. If you want to explore that in a paper, that could be very interesting, right? Um, so I will leave you to think about that. Maybe we can discuss that a bit on Wednesday as well. And yeah, we came in pretty short at less than 30 minutes here. I'm trying to keep these at reasonable bite-sized chunks so your brain does not get too tired. So tune into the next lecture where we'll continue on Descartes, and that is it.